Have you actually updated these sentences?
I go to my profile, and then at the top, when you're done, at the top right is actions, save changes, which was helpful because I thought I lived in 208 instead of 209. And so my first CMPA stuff, I like left a note across the hall. I was like, if anything comes for me, like please pass. So my first CMPA was like shoved under my door.
I have no conflict of interest. I'll just say that. So we're going to talk a little bit about critical appraisal, talking about an article presentation. I know I think almost all of you have done that. I will present an article of journal article that I thought was important. I put it in the Dropbox, and I think because really ultimately want you to be able to dissect the literature to think whether or not it changes your practice and what you're actually doing in terms of care. And also what you're going to find out with your search and learn topics too is that if somebody came up to you, how would you also explain this in lay language? And I have not provided an example of that. We'll see how foggy my brain is at the end of it. And then we're going to talk at the end a little bit about a 2-page protocol for your scholarly project. So what are the expectations of you for developing your project? And then you actually have to write it out because you have to send it to ethics, you have to send it to the RSAC committee, which is the resident scholarly activities. So just talk a little bit about that, but most of you have an idea about it. So what does critical appraisal mean?
Criticizing the paper
Sorry, criticizing paper and?
in a scientific way.
Okay. So you,
Nothing necessarily for that.
Criticizing is not always
so you
negative.
see there's positive reward.
I would say criticizing though generally is a negative.
Right, and in fact, it's quite easy to actually.
is different than
Are you thinking critiquing?
Maybe it's just like thinking about what you're reading as opposed to just
Thinking it. Yeah.
Well, I don't know, I think both Karen and Jonathan have actually only get one. Okay, so here you go. It's a positive stimulus for some commentary. You can trade them away, don't like your color. And so I think that's what some of the context is that people say, well, you just want to go to these evenings of journal article presentations, you just shred it apart. Now, part of it is later on, you're actually going to have competitions where we're going to give you teams, and you're going to get an idea and say, design a study. And in fact, when you move forward with your scholarly project and also in this competition, you actually realize it's quite hard sometimes to design a study. So there may be flaws, there may be ways to move forward. Maybe they didn't anticipate some of those problems they might have seen. Okay, so anything else? Sorry, Linda. So where does it sit within all the other literature too? And I remember, it's been a while, I remember that I said, none of this stuff made any sense to me. I could barely kind of struggle to actually present the paper, and I've got a few gray hairs, so I presented a few articles, and I understand the context of many of the articles that I actually review, so it's a lot easier for me to kind of say, okay, it's this little slice here and this bigger pie here, okay? But that's part of what it is. So, and then critical appraisal is saying how much of what do I accept that are actually in those findings, and does it change my mind or influence me in terms of the question. And it really also makes me feel more confident too, right? Because if it's the 17 randomized controlled study that says that aspirin is good for Kawasaki's coronary artery dilatations, when the family comes to me and says, well, we read this one here, Celia, blah, 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 and it said it was negative, and then I can say, well, there were 17 randomized controlled studies, blah, blah, blah. I think that probably there may be differences in populations, or there may be some explanation for why it didn't work, but I think that overall the benefits are still higher than the risks. So this is a definition that somebody put forward as a process of carefully and systematically examining research to judge its trustworthiness and its value, and its relevance in a particular context. So I put that in the context of the family, but it's also the current literature. So this is actually sort of the little algorithm, and I think you've already heard about the PIPO tool. Okay, we talked a little bit about it, population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. And I borrowed some of the slides from a McMaster evidence-based critical appraisal talk. One of the things that they said that, you know, you need to ask answerable questions. So you already found this out from the librarian, Jen, remember? And then she says you need to search for your evidence, or if you can find a pre-appraised resource, you can miss out on the next step. Does anybody have any reflections or comments by saying, if you find a systematic review, you don't have to look any further? James is laughing over there. He knows me.
Yeah, I think that's a little naive, and I think in the same way that you wouldn't believe just any study you found, I think you should still take a critical eye to systematic reviews as well, because like I think has been said in this course before, if you put junk into a systematic review, you're going to get junk out.
Did you already get a chocolate?
No.
Thank you. Everyone will have one this morning, but anyway. But the thing is that the question in the situation may not be exactly the same. It may be older systematic review, and even though I know we talk about a pyramid of evidence and what's supposed to be at that top of that pyramid of evidence, systematic, you know, exactly, I kind of say, that's my own personal, is that I like to go back to primary resources just to make sure, because people always go in with a certain bias even when they're doing systematic reviews. Okay, so we've already talked about PICO, and we've already talked about the pyramid, but in pediatrics often we don't have tons of RCTs, and so we're going to have to look at these quote-unquote lower level of evidence. And unfortunately, that's where often much of the pediatric literature comes from, is in this particular area, and there's nothing wrong with it. It helps build up in terms of the evidence that's there. So these are the set of slides. I actually like most of it. But I think the thing is what they're saying on the 3 principles of evidence-based medicine. So you need awareness of the best available information. Not all evidence is equal, but what do I mean by evidence alone is never enough?
You need to think about the context in which you're reading things.
Absolutely, because it may be that I have a child who's not exactly like what most of those populations are like, and then I'm going to have to kind of, again, weigh the risks and the benefits of things. So do I tell the parents, like, it's not exactly like the systematic reviews, and I say I'm making this decision, or how do I approach the family in terms of saying, your child is a little bit unique? Do I just dogmatically make the decision myself?
Informed consent.
Sorry?
Informed consent.
Helps. Okay. Have you ever been in a situation where you've been making decisions that have been sort of outside the box? Do you involve the family or the individual, the client? I get some yeses over there. I was looking in the middle of the room.
I don't know if I feel like on wards it doesn't happen necessarily as often as it does in clinics, because I think decisions are often made more quickly, and I don't know if people would disagree, but there's been times where things have been done that were the right thing, but I would question whether they were actually, the parents were informed of why we were doing it, or how, sort of like blood products, or, you know what I mean? Like,
I did have one case on the ward where we had 2 potential therapies, and like one was like thought to be a better specific therapy for the condition, whereas one was like a more general therapy, but like the specific therapy had like certain drawbacks as well that like would make it less convenient and less less easily applied to the child and the family than the like more general one. And that was like a discussion with the parents where like you could do either of these things, and this one had better evidence that this one is.
So how did the family deal with that, James, when they had that conversation?
I think they appreciated having that be input, and then I think it gave them some time to think like what would more easily fit into their lives and like what would be a better option for them. And then they came to us and asked for more questions for clarification. But then we were looking at the discussion of what like a reasonable option would be.
I do agree, like often, like I've seen just one kid came in with like IBD and was scoped by GI, like known IBD, and I get a call from GI, hey, we're gonna start this kid on this medication, and I go tell the parents, but there was never a discussion, I don't think, with them about risks and benefits of starting this treatment with the parents.
I guess what I mean is I don't think that happens all the time, but I would it seems like compared to when I've been in a clinic and there seems to be more time to decide, or someone has to come back for a treatment, that more often than not, even if there's one main treatment and that's the right one, that when there's one main one, often there isn't still a discussion about what if we didn't do that. It's kind of a, but we'll of course do this, and then having a discussion, which isn't really, I would argue.
It may also just be, I guess just maybe a judge, not a judgment, a guess, is that you're on time versus Oak was like, we discussed everything with parents.
See, that's a problem. Like,
I agree, like, I'm not saying it's right.
there's absolutely no reason that every single one of those parents and or who are doing the system,
It's
that's
for
for sure.
but I think that could just be.
But
I know it would, I'm sure it would be different compared to Elm, just by nature of you have parents who tend to ask before you even, whatever. Like, you don't have an option to not discuss, but I would also argue that if someone doesn't know, like, if you came to me and my child was sick and you said, this is what we have to do, I presumably would proceed if you told me as the professional that that's what I should have to do. You never gave me the option to consider that maybe that wasn't an option.
So have any of you ever been in the situation where you had to ponder choices yourselves? Because you're healthcare professionals now, right? So you have have any, put your hands up, have you ever had to ponder healthcare options? Yeah, lots of two. So, hand up, you had a few things about pine too. I was listening.
it's like, more on high note. We had a kid, this is not about discussing treatment, but we had a kid who totally got like iatrogenic MRSA bacteremia from like an IV that was infected that wasn't found, and staff's comment was, had this been on Elm, it would have been a lawsuit.
Okay, and then we're not even going to get into disclosure to families and all that kind of stuff. But the thing is that, so you see context, and that's the same way that we also, when we look at the literature, is that I wear the context, and I may read an article, and then most of the time I read articles specifically around the patients. I get all these subscriptions, and I kind of go, oh, yeah, I'm not really interested, not interested, put it in the pile. A year later, I may rip out articles that I think, oh, that might make a great journal club article, because it's really hard to stay on top of the literature. And so most of the time is that I end up doing specific searches on certain topics or something that interests me, and I tend to retain the information better. I felt like a terrible pediatric resident, because I look at this pediatrics article and I say, I don't remember any of those articles, and I just throw it away, and it was kind of like, whatever. I mean, I filed them and stuff like that, but I retain things when I do a deliberate search, because I'm going and I'm motivated to do that. So we talked a little bit about the hierarchy of of evidence, and so we talk about the N of 1 clinical trial. So if you've got a patient that doesn't kind of fit directly into kind of a particular category, but you may use them and treat them and say, well, this works. It's atypical in terms of the management strategy, but I'm going to do that. Then randomized control studies, and all the way down to clinical experience. So with time, you're going to say, yeah, that's good. I know all of that. So it's really just saying evidence is never enough by itself. You put it into context, and it's also experience, values from the families, and your values too in terms of what you share. So, excuse me. So these are some of the critical appraisal tools that I'm sharing with you, and will be in this talk. One of the ones I'll highlight here is called CASP. It's the Critical Appraisal Skills Program. I forgot to bring in my pink book. It's called, by Ian Crombie. It's old. It's a critical appraisal checklist. So for different kinds of studies, you can go through, and these are kind of, did they talk about, were the people who are checking, were they blinded to what the results, or how is the allocation done? Various things that we do. And so sometimes those are helpful to have, these checklists. Exactly, you've got it. Okay, you just click on the CASP. Another one, the Equator Network talks about tools for writing, and also what's required to have in, say, a randomized control study, which is like a consort diagram, which you've probably all seen and never really kind of known what its name is. This is called a consort diagram here, where you start with your population, and then they're either allocated to groups, or how many are lost to follow-up, and how many are randomized, but this kind of a figure is called consort diagrams. So we're going to talk about a cohort study. So this is the CASP cohort. And it actually talks about, this isn't a really detailed checklist, but it says that It's asking about validity that somebody had mentioned earlier. So they said that, I think that was you, Linda. Are the results of the study valid? What are the results? Will the results help locally? So it's again, application back down to it. I've already asked you that. We talked yesterday a little bit about it. So now in your evening journal or club sessions, there are going to be 2 articles that are presented. And you've probably seen that there are themes. So this is going to be randomized control. This is a cohort. This is cross-sectional quality improvement, excuse me. There is a resource person who you can go to ask questions about, but you can have multiple people who can be your resource person too. Like it's okay to ask and say that, could I have the content expert come as well? Because that content expert then kind of helps you situate this article in the context of whatever all that information is out there. We're not expecting you to say, oh, I'm an expert in terms of aspirin and Kawasaki's disease. You know that it's helpful, but and then I know we're talking about it ultimately is that everybody then prepare a 1-page summary of the article, just 1 page in terms, it's almost like a mini abstract in a way, or a mini article, just start talking about what did you glean out of the information and where did it sit within the context of it. Often only the people that are invited to the journal clubs are the residents and then the resource person and then the hosting people who provide the food. But I actually think it's really important to have more staff come to it because everybody has a little bit of gray hair to add into the conversation. The NERD rotation is the BC Emerge resident equivalent to ask. They call it NERD. And so you can go on the search NERD and they've got some nice templates. So what I wanted to do was start up by looking at this New England Journal on the impact of BMI in adolescents on cardiovascular events in adults. Okay? Before I do that, before I start talking about it, I was just going to show you the BMI charts. Now, you've already heard mention a little bit that we have new BMI charts that we're using. Okay, so they're called the 2014 WHO growth charts for Canada. And set 1 and set 2, and set 2 is supposed to be made, the official one we have. This just got different centile lines on it. The younger children information actually came from international. So all the kids under the age of 5. So most of the kids under the age of 2 are all from an international study from 6 different countries. But do you know where the data came for most of the kids who are older than 5 all the way up to age 19? Any idea where those older kids came from? It's North American data. So it's NHANES data back from the 70s and the 80s, and that they wanted to get rid of any obesity that was allowed in the CDC 2000 growth charts. So some people were using the CDC charts, but because the population had an obesity epidemic, that they actually normalized the increased weight so that the weight Z scores increased quite a bit, and the BMI similarly increased. And so that it normalized people to be overweight or obese relative to what the WHO actually thinks the population is. So what the WHO did is it went back and it took all of the kids that helped make up those CDC growth charts and it eliminated a number and it trimmed it down. And it said that this is really what it thought the population should have been like in the 70s and 80s. So before you were born, unfortunately, but in terms of when everybody was a little bit leaner before the 80s and 90s, not through that in terms of the obesity epidemic. So in adults, we have standard definitions for obesity. Can anybody tell me what the obesity definition is in adults?
You have it in 20 minutes.
So you have to be 30 kilograms per meter square. So this arrow here, okay? And overweight is? Right, so it's absolutely here. But this is, I don't know if you carefully looked at the BMI growth chart for children before. Does anybody know what this white zone down here in kids from the ages of 2 to 19, what does that represent, that white zone? Sorry? Underweight. Okay, that's underweight, okay? The definitions, we allow kids up to the age of 5 to be slightly pudgier than the kids who are over 5 years of age. And part of it is that the tracking of your BMI as a youngster is not as solid or not as highly associated with what your BMI is going to be like as an adult, right? So what is considered to be overweight is actually in this yellow zone here. That's overweight here, but we allow And the light yellow under here, under age of 5, is considered risk of overweight. So this is overweight in here. So you can see that this is the 85th centile to the 97th centile. And then obesity is up in these two areas here. And this dark peach is actually called severe obesity, but I don't ever use that particular adjective when I talk to parents. I don't think it gives me any extra points by saying the child severely obese. Okay, so these are our new definitions for overweight or obesity. So now that you know what our new definitions are, we talked a little bit about the cardiovascular events. I'm just going to go with mine. So part of it is that I'm going to talk a little bit about why did I pick this particular PowerPoint. So why did I pick this particular article to present to you? It's got a nice high impact factor, which means that it may well be important. Do you know anybody know what the impact factor of the New England Journal is? 65. It's pretty high. The reasons I'm interested, I got to see lots of growth issues in endocrinology, but most of the time it's height and not so much weight. I'm not really I look after short, fat children. The skinny, short children please go to GI or clinical nutrition. And the overweight children, I may see them for diabetes, but they really need to have a larger team help them in terms of choices of activities and foods and things like that. So the article said has a high impact factor. I looked at who the authors were. It's an Israeli group, and Dr. Jeremy Kark is the senior author, is actually an expert in looking at epidemiology, and particularly cardiovascular death. So this is his big area of interest. So I thought, okay, that was really important. So I thought, were the authors qualified? I thought so too. And talked a little bit already that we know over the past couple of decades, the number of kids who are obese or overweight or obese have actually risen dramatically. Do you know what percentage of the Canadian population is actually overweight or obese? Like the yellow and the peach zone together?
It's 25%.
It's about 30%. Okay, in about that range. In terms of the number of kids who are obese, yeah, close. It's about 13% of the kids. And in fact, that's double what it was in the 1980s. So in fact, there's been a huge shift that both of those have increased substantially. And the question is that does that actually have an impact on adult health? And we know that in general, there's been a decline in cardiovascular deaths in older adults, but overall the rates of cardiovascular death in younger adults really hasn't declined. And so there was really a question is that because this wave of kids who started becoming obese in the 1980s is now through into 2017, is that actually having an impact in terms of why we might not be seeing a decline in young adults in terms of cardiovascular deaths? So the primary objective was to assess the risk of fatal cardiovascular events in adulthood and looking at the association related to BMI as a late adolescent, and also estimating the proportion of the cardiovascular deaths that could be attributed to increased prevalence of either overweight or obesity in adolescents. They also said to associate between late adolescence BMI and coronary artery disease, stroke, or sudden death in adulthood, so taking down their final endpoints and breaking it into 3 subsets. So what was important and why it was impressive is that you can actually see in the title. So the title is really helpful. What's striking about this title?
2.3 million.
That's really large, because when you look at some of the literature, they might have some Danish or Swedish studies that have like 100,000 or maybe 200,000 individuals that they follow up and looking at. It's large. It's really large. And so what the methods were is that in Israel, as many of you know, that there is compulsory army service. However, not if you're a woman of Orthodox faith. And so that all 17-year-old Israeli adolescents had a medical checkup 1 year prior to their going into the army. And that they were all measured in a very systematic approach. So they all were in their underpants when they were getting their weight done, and they had a stadiometer in terms of measuring them. And so that they actually had 2.4 million. They did exclude a number of individuals, 64,000, because either there was no height or weight, and you can see that. And 92,000 because they were not from a representative, not, it's too many negatives. Because they were from non-Jewish population, they felt that they weren't representative of kind of the Jewish Israeli population, so they discarded another 92,000.
Is military compulsory for all adolescents or all Jewish adolescents?
All.
Okay.
Except that
Because that
Orthodox,
wasn't very clear.
from my understanding, it's all.
Oh, unless you have a, like.
Unless you're an
religious
Orthodox.
Or other.
Exactly. But as far as I understand, if you're 17 in Israel, correct me if I'm wrong.
I think there's like some Arab Israelis who would not be under compulsory duty. I know like the Druids or something like that. Druids, yeah.
They wouldn't.
Do it, but I don't think it's compulsory. They like just all decide.
Maybe like an immigrant too, you can do it, but you're not required. And I don't know what happens if you're really disabled or you then just do like.
That's right.
If there are people who are volunteering, they're maybe more healthy.
But the thing
Almost
is that we're,
I think that was the 62,000 numbers.
well, there was no height and weight, and then the 92,000
Oh, right.
felt that they were not representative. So it's actually quite, I mean, it says it's not really representative of the Orthodox female population, but otherwise it sounds like it's really fairly representative. But you still have mixed.
I didn't really get why those 90 were excluded.
Me neither.
though. Is that like a valid exclusion? Just like,
Anyway, it's a small
I
number.
wanted them to explain more.
Exactly, and I looked in the,
Like opt in rather than opt like.
Oh, see, I interpreted it not so much, I mean, that's why there's less, but more that they're summarizing, it's like internal validity, they're summarizing the Jewish population, and to the researchers, people of a different background that are not like a representative number in this population compared to what happened outside of the military, meant it wasn't representative.
and so where that ultimately will come in as part of our critique is the whole generalizability, right? The external validity of it, because if you're then focusing on this group here, you're not looking at the larger group, but we're going to come back to it. But I agree, they didn't give a lot, but you're actually quite tight in the words that they give here, and it wasn't in the appendix, I had to look at it. There were 36,000 deaths of this 2.3 million that they followed, and they followed them from 1967 to 2010. So these are all of those groups during that period. So they said the sample was representative of Jewish men, but not of women. Their primary outcomes were death before June 30th, 2011 due to coronary artery disease, stroke, or sudden death. And sudden death, I guess they kind of assumed was probably a cardiovascular event. And that they were using ICD-9 codes, so those are the international classification definitions in terms of using their codes to actually look at it. They looked at non-cardiovascular deaths as well too, and that they double-checked. They said that the information from the Israeli Bureau of Statistics and also the Military Health Examination Database to try and look for cause of death. What they collected in terms of the variables is they calculated the BMI, but they were not using our WHO standards, they were using the CDC standards. And as you remember, the difference between the CDC and the WHO is that CDC allowed what with the BMI? To higher, right? So they're using CDC criteria. And that they classified them, and this is a little bit different about the study, that they used the under the 5th to the white zone on they said that was underweight. They do the 5th to the 24th as their reference population, and then they compare the next chunk up, the 24th to the 9th to the 49th, the 50th to 75, 75 to 84, and 85 to 94, which is overweight, and 95 plus is obesity. And they also then pulled out age, year, birth, height. They looked at the degree of education, how many years of education that they had, and they used an area-based socioeconomic categorization, whether they had low, medium, or high socioeconomic status. So we already do this in Canada, that we have something called dissemination areas, and that someone goes around the country and actually looks at chunks of populations and said, this population, these 3 blocks here of 400 to 700 individuals have roughly the same education, roughly the same employment status, roughly the same kind of access to their living in a house or they live in an apartment. And so you are classified across Canada in every neighborhood that you do that actually gives them information about material and social deprivation indices. But they use something here from Israel. So they had the place of origin, which was the birthplace of dad or grandfather. It was funded through the Environment and Health Fund, which I assume is probably an Israeli state fund. We didn't really talk about it. And there was REB approval. So So they were looking at the calculated unadjusted rates of death per year. And so you've probably seen those fancy Kaplan-Meier curves. You know, it's time to the event. So this was time to death. And that you actually then use a proportional hazards model, we'll talk to you a little bit later on about it, to actually estimate the hazard ratio. So your risk compared to the control group, your risk of early cardiovascular disease. They started their time right at the time of whenever the original exam is. And remember, they recruited people from 1967 to 2010, and they were looking at death at 2011. They did a couple of different tests to look at the effect of time on this. So they had 36,000 deaths, of which 90% of those were deaths in men and 10% of the deaths were in women. And in the time between 1967 and 1980, they only had 3,000 deaths, and they had information on 800 missing deaths. And 3,000 deaths were actually due to military service, so perhaps it wasn't a good year to be in the Army between 1967 and 1980. Between 1981 and 2011, there were 32,000 deaths, so over a longer period of time, so that was 30 years compared to the 13 years when there were 3,000, almost not 4,000 deaths. There were 32,000 deaths, of which 1,600 had missing information. And then they actually calculated these population attributable fractions, which we'll talk about, and population attributable risk percentages, which is the proportion by which the cardiovascular deaths in the population would be reduced if you actually eliminated overweight or obesity. So they calculated those. So let's have a look at table 1. We've already had a look at, figure 1, we've had just a little bit of the flow, what's going on. And so we're now in the results section. So we're going to look at, this is table 1. And it is really just describing the population, and it talks about, you can see that roughly about, most of the time, 60 to 70% of all of the recruits were men. So we knew that there were the Orthodox women who could refuse. It talks about what their median BMI is, and it gave an absolute amount, because the thing is that we usually use centiles. So in adults, you say 25 and above is overweight, and 30 and above is obese. And it puts in their height, and it gives a little bit of information in terms of what country did they come from. And you can see about 75% of them finished high school. About 2/3 of them fit within the 5th to the 74th centile, so most of them fit within.
I was confused about the finishing high school thing, because aren't they all in high school?
Well, they don't have to. Well, they might have dropped out. So 25% of them dropped out. And 25% came from the lower socioeconomic status, and they saw that particularly in the underweight, in the overweight and obesity group. They saw particularly more people of lower socioeconomic status in those two extremes of it. And there was a fairly good range of countries between Africa all the way up to former USSR, but 85% of them were born in Israel. So again, it's sort of talking a little bit about how generalizable it is. Okay, we're good?
This is a piggy point, but if they had done it of the mother's his country of origin, like I'm just picturing knowing Jewish friends here and how they, like, if you're male, you marry a female and she changes to, but like, would there have been a difference in what was represented?
I don't know, because you're right, through the Jewish religion, that it's sort of the mother's religion that dictates the children's religion. I don't know.
Right.
Okay, let's raise that point. I have no idea, it was completely, I think it's probably arbitrary. So, was there anything else about table 1 that you want to have a look at? Okay, so table 2 was the duration of follow-up and cause of death according to percentile of BMI during adolescence. So across the top, it's the different percentiles. So it doesn't matter when you started, it's just your different percentiles as an adolescent. And then it's actually then looking at your causes of death. And at the far right on the table is merging all the percentiles. So it's sort of the average of it, but then you can look at each one of the individual ones. Now, do you notice anything at all in the trends on table 2?
Me, there's like almost 90% of it. sudden death in Australia.
Sorry, Habib, I really can't hear.
That males are the predominant in deaths.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct.
Their study follow-up, their median follow-up decreases as the BMI percentile decrease presumably because there are more deaths in the
It could be that, or also too that as we get out, we're seeing the effect of the 80s and 90s obesity
People got
epidemic.
better as the study progressed.
That's correct. So you start with a relatively lean population in the 1967s, but as we move along, then you increase your proportion of kids who are overweight or
But
obese.
oh, okay, I understand.
Okay. You see, if you were using the 25th to the 49th, so it's your third column in, as our reference, so we're saying between the 25th and the 49th is a 17-year-old in your BMI. Look at 50th, 75th, 85th, and greater than 95th centile in terms of, and look at the incident rate per 10,000 person years, because we're doing a follow-up, so we're following all of these 2.3 million kids out, and we're counting and
It looks
following.
like there's a linear relationship.
It looks like
as your BMI increases, your risk increases.
So as your BMI as a 17-year-old was higher relative to your peers, it looked like you have a higher cardiovascular death rate. Death rate. Does everybody see that? Okay. And so this is an unadjusted one, right? Because we haven't put in anything in terms of other potential risk factors or confounders, which I know you know all about, right? So really around the 50th to 74th centile, you actually start to see an increase in the risks. So they had 25 million year follow-up in men, which means that they followed them along for 25 million years of follow-up. So each person is counted in for every year until they die, because then the data, it stops, their clock stops when they die. We're going to come back to that. And 16.3 million person year follow-up in women. So they said that they had 263 deaths in men and 285 in women. So that's what you had said, Habib, that most of the deaths are in men. And the mean age for death was 47 years for cardiovascular, 46 for stroke, and 41 for sudden death. Is that really a nice, cheery kind of?
Well, it's just because of the time that, like, their population age, right?
Sure, of course, because it's a young population, because we were recruiting from 1967, so the oldest one could be out to 2010, right? So you're adding 33 plus 10, 43.
But they would have been.
Oh, plus is 17, that's right. So 60.
So 60.
60.
But most people wouldn't be 60.
No.
The earliest,
That'd be the
because the earliest they'd be born would be 1950.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the one thing too is they recruited until 2010.
Correct.
And only measured till 2011.
Correct.
So that person
18.
could have been like 18.
And died.
Yeah,
Or
but
not
they
died.
were not died because
Correct.
how often do
I know.
18-year-olds die of cardiovascular?
Some of them do, unfortunately, but not very many disproportionately, but they had to set it somewhere. But I also think they probably wanted to follow up another study, so they have their cohort already defined. I digress. So, and in fact, the lowest rates of death per person year was lowest in those who had the BMI as a 17-year-old in the 25th to 49th group. And in fact, actually, you could see higher rates in under the 5th percentile. So if you were underweight, you were also at increased risk as a 17-year-old of having a cardiovascular death. So what I actually like you to have a look at next is figure 2. Which is a Kaplan-Meier curve. Does everybody have this? Do we have a look at it? Okay. Does anyone want to tell me what they see? Sorry? It's not a very encouraging curve, is it? So at the bottom is person years of follow-up. So we could see, so time to event and the crude numbers of the event are in the bottom, and that's actually really important when you're doing the Kaplan-Meier curve, because you want to actually see that by 40 years, they don't actually have a lot of people that they're following up, right? That originally, participants at risk, they had 1.7 million, and at the end, at the 40-year follow-up, they only had 160,000 participants at risk. And you can see that there are a relatively small number of deaths early on in the first decade, and yet you can also see that the red line is those who are people who are obese. So you can see this graded response. So does it have anything to do with what Kelly Russell was just talking about in terms of this this is what we would call a graded response in terms of that the higher your BMI was over your 25th to 49th centile, your increased risk for early cardiovascular death, okay, when you're 17. If you go back and think, my BMI was 17.
About the number of like people who actually made it to 40 years
Yes.
follow-up. Like if the median, like if the average age of death was like 47,
Yes.
and they like say that they have this huge N, but the number of people who are actually making it anywhere close to that is like actually way smaller than that.
Correct, but then look at 30 years. So look at the 30-year follow-up there, it's
Yeah.
respectable. It's pretty respectable. Because you're right, the small numbers, you worry about small numbers pulling, swaying your judgment, but it's a small effect and small number, and that's not really generalizable. But I think what's helpful to see is that even at 30 years, you're beginning to see it, even at 20 years, you're beginning to see this graded response. So it's nice to see this consistent response over time. You don't have centiles crisscrossing in any way. So this is all unadjusted. So we then talked about some confounders. Can you think of some of the confounders or other variables that you might want to put in to adjust for some of these things?
Status.
Okay. So they didn't actually have that because, again, you have to remember that they were talking about the deaths was typically at 40 years, and this is a measurement at 17 years of age. Mind you, it was a well-done measurement. What are some of the things that they actually did have besides they had the BMI? They had socioeconomic status. Sorry? Sex, that's right, because in terms of cardiovascular, women are usually protected with estrogen. We don't get our cardiovascular events until after menopause.
With SES, with SES, they have it at 17. They don't have it
Absolutely.
any further on. And
Absolutely.
I know people in the state that that's a huge.
Absolutely. There are a number of things. We don't know smoking, we don't know all those lifestyle things like exercise and things, all those healthy things that you do.
It's like, right? They didn't do like blood pressure or
Nope.
if people had diabetes or.
Right, and then often we know that there's clustering things of there may be hypercholesterolemia or there may be increased cardiovascular risk in family that we still don't understand what those are. So those are some of the limitations we'll talk about in the discussion.
I was wondering too with the ICD codes, like if someone dies from a diabetic related concern, but they also have heart things, depending on how you code, like there are a lot of people who wouldn't be coded as cardio, but that might have ultimately led to them coming to hospital, but they died in hospital out.
Exactly.
And it
So,
doesn't, it doesn't look at MIs or any sort of cardiac event.
Yeah, I was wondering that too, because like not everyone dies from.
Often when
Like
people
it's
die
like,
in
well, let's look at
hospital,
mortality, that's fine.
correct. And what they did do is that they actually kind of grouped it all together. Part of it is in table 2. It was actually relatively small numbers in each of those cardiovascular events, either it be a stroke or a coronary disease and then sudden death. So they grouped it together, and I think they had a little more power in terms of looking at it. But you're right that there are issues in using administrative data because there are limits in terms of what do we really know that somebody said, yes, it was a stroke or it
Also, I
wasn't.
assume the treatment of cardiovascular disease changed like hugely between 1967 and 2011, so that your survival might be.
But most of the deaths proportionally happened from 1980 to, and I have to tell you, medicine from 1980 to now has changed somewhat, but,
Well,
you know.
especially too, if you're having like a cardiac event in your 40s, you're more likely to die from it, is my understanding, than if you have it in your late 20s.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just like, I feel like there's a large proportion we're not capturing in that.
Oh,
like,
no
there are
question.
people
Hence the ICD
who
code.
definitely have
Yeah.
cardiovascular disease, but who did not die.
So they actually put forward a number of, in their results, they talked a little bit about hazard ratios. So those individuals who were obese at 17 had a hazard ratio of 4.9 with a confidence interval of 3.9 to 6.1, so that it was very high, so that they were about 5 times higher risk of outcome compared to the reference population when they were for the 17-year-olds. That's quite high, 5, and they're quite tight confidence intervals, so there's a little variability because you've got lots of numbers here, but that's actually quite a high hazard ratio. And that even having being above the 50th to 75th percentile, there was a hazard ratio. Most of the time it's about 1.4, so there's still a 40% chance increased risk of an early cardiovascular event in this population if your BMI was even in the 50th to the 75th centile, and that actually works out from about a BMI of 20 to 22.4, which is actually quite a narrow BMI. It's a very normal BMI. Compared to having a BMI of 17.5 to 19.9. And I forgot to point out to you, and I was bad, that the BMIs in adults at the cutoffs of 25 and 30 are actually based on increased risk of outcomes of bad death, but they're empiric in children. We don't actually have data to say that this BMI of the 97th centile or the 85th centile out of this paper actually gave an increased risk of anything down the road other than if you were in the higher ranges of the centiles, that you were more likely to be obese as an adult. So if you were overweight or obese as a child and you were older, you were more likely to have that. But this is one of the first papers that's actually said that as a childhood, you now would appear in this population to have somewhat increased risk of death. And actually, in the appendix, they actually showed a nice U-shaped graph that said if your BMI was 18.3 or less, you had an increased risk of cardiovascular death. And that 20.3, there was an increase on that side. So it was sort of between about 18.4 and 20.2 when you were 17 years of age. For this population, it was probably the best BMI that you probably could have for your adult health, bar all those other confounders that we talked about. And they said that the hazard ratio increased by 1.5 for women or men for every increment in 1 unit or 1 standard deviation score in the Z score. So every chunk when you go up one of those centile lines is a chunk up with the 1 standard deviation. When they look at the population attributable fraction, so if the BMI is higher than 50th centile as an adolescent, about 28% of deaths from cardiovascular deaths, 28% of deaths from cardiovascular deaths and 36% for coronary artery diseases could actually have been prevented if those people weren't actually above the 50th centile. So you could probably save about a third to a quarter of those deaths and the cost of that management if adolescents were not above the 50th centile. That's actually a fair chunk in terms of what it saved in terms of cost to health care. So positioning this paper, it says that there is certainly an association, not causation. Why would we not say it's causation? Why are we saying it's association?
You can't say that that's what the source of their cause is.
Right, we don't know all those other things. It's
All those things we don't know.
it's a retrospective analysis of a cohort. We don't know all those other factors out there. How would you design a study to know whether or not that being a BMI 50th or higher has an increased risk of having early death at age 40?
You can't randomize people to be high.
So I'm not wearing my ethics hat right now, Alexa. So design the worst study possible.
You could like prospectively follow and then keep track of all the other things that you think are causing confounders. So even if you didn't actually randomize, you could temporally and following all of our causality things check off
We
like.
can increase the obesity probability for every patient that is randomized
So Habib wants to do an arson. He wants to do this. We're gonna.
How would you like forcefully make someone high?
You wouldn't, which is why I did. But I think you
For
could,
example,
Easier than for
you could jump on the Framingham study and just have them recruit them earlier.
So that if you prospectively start and go forward.
Right, so a prospective design would help and you would be able to collect information on various confounders in terms of doing this. A randomized control study sounds super ethical. You are randomized to be super skinny. You are randomized to be super fat.
We do not care that we also
I'm not even
like to
talking about like
die.
ethics, but practicality.
You can't take that into
You will
account.
come and we will force feed you.
Yeah.
In this,
Or like force starve you, potentially.
They did
Exactly.
BMIs before the army.
Yes.
I assume like if I entered the army, my physical
I would
ability
say
was
that
massively
Within like a year or two.
But let's say it before.
Okay. So what this paper actually, there have been several other papers, a Danish and Swedish cohort that actually looked at saying that by having a BMI in the overweight or obese is only increase the risk for early cardiovascular events and increased risk of deaths as an adult. But no one had looked and broken it down into the lower BMIs that we assume are normal, the 50th, the 74th, and the 75th, up to the 85th, who we've always deemed as healthy. And as we talk to our families, we say, yes, this is a great BMI here. Okay. The association was graded in risk, and that also was similar for both sexes when they took that into it. There was one study that did not agree with these findings, but when you looked at it, we actually realized that it actually looked at prospective study from those born between 1920 to 1950, and there was no increased risk of cardiovascular deaths. Any reason why you think that study might be different than this study? That's right. So in terms of maybe a difference, and so that's the temporal trend, why are we seeing what we're seeing now is this cohort from the 80s and the 90s is moving forward. In the 20s and the 50s, we didn't have the same kind of rates. So we said 6% of kids in 1978 were obese, and now it's 13% using the WHO criteria. So it's important to look at that. So why do you think that the adolescent BMI has an impact on adult cardiovascular outcomes? Any ideas? They hypothesized. So they talked about maybe just having, even as an adolescent, your lipid values may be abnormal. We know atheromatosis started at an early age, see that in young kids. And so whether or not, and vascular impairment, anti-inflammation, dysglycemia, some borderline changes may cumulatively have an impact. So that's one hypothesis. Whether or not there's also a phase, is it that, sort of like Doe had, but Doe had at an adolescent age group, so it's kind of like, is there some imprinting or something that you're getting with your methylation at this age that's having an impact later on? I don't know. Is it also because we talked about that we know that older children track better from obesity if they're obese as an adolescent, more likely to be obese as an adult? So is there better tracking compared to younger kids, or you're picking them at 17 and that they're essentially then following that track into adulthood? So we've already talked about limitations. So we only had the adolescent BMI 17 at one point. We don't have smoking, we don't have exercise or fitness, we don't know all the other BMIs that they have, we don't know anything about their family history in terms of other cardiovascular risks there to do. Okay. There's certainly a number of strengths that they did a standardized intake, weight, they knew their ethnicity, and they had some of that information. We know that there's still relatively small number of events of death, of 36,000 in their 42 million years of follow-up. One of the things I worry about is that I don't think that they actually took into account the number of individuals who might have emigrated, might have left Israel, and they could have died elsewhere. What would have that done to our numbers? So say you had, of these 2.3 million, say that 500,000 people moved elsewhere, and then they all died.
Loss of follow-up. Yeah.
So the loss of follow-up, but you see, the thing is that...
But you don't know what BMI they were.
I would have known them at 17. So I had my 2.3 million, I had their measurement at...
Environmental factors you cannot take into account.
Sorry, I cannot hear.
Environmental factors that you cannot take into account.
Sure, but say they all died.
But they're looking at death records in Israel.
Only looking at it, but still you have to understand.
But like if they die
are
elsewhere,
those
they're just
more higher
they
BMI
representative of
that
something
left or lower BMI that left?
So we don't know. So they didn't actually tell us. They didn't tell us, and they should have been able to link this administrative data to actually say how many people stayed in Israel the whole time and how many left. Some of those died, okay, and some of those lived. Okay?
And were they a random selection of people that died at the same rate of the same thing, or did they all die of something different and it's not being captured?
But we don't know anything about this. Say that they all died, and in fact, is this what they're presenting is an overestimate or an underestimate of the true cardiovascular death rates in these 17-year-olds? It's an underestimate because all of these people that died, because remember we knew that there were 32,000 that died, but say that you actually knew that there were 45,000 that died, okay, then you're actually underestimating your impact on
Did they know whether people had left Israel?
No, they didn't make any comment on that, okay?
Which is confusing because if you're looking at death records and or what they're doing, then you wouldn't know.
But you would assume they're still
You
alive.
could assume they're still alive.
No, but you would have some health records somewhere, something. Like
I don't know if they had access to those stuff.
But the thing is that with, like, that's what you've heard and you'll hear later on this week or next week, talk about CHP, so that's the Manitoba Center for Health Policy, and we have all these linked administrative databases, and so I know births, I know deaths, I know educational outcomes, I know all of these things, so I can trace back. You have a FIN or a 9-digit number, which is part of your how you get healthcare in Manitoba and how we track people in Manitoba. That's scrambled.
Even if you did like taxes, who's been paying their taxes, you know if all of a sudden a number of people who are paying, like
But
maybe they
didn't
aren't.
say
but-
whether they did that.
No,
I know, but this is the point, like there's ways to easily
Right.
to do that if you choose to.
correct. So, and they don't make any comment in this, but it underestimates. So we're getting an underestimate. So if anything, it probably is higher. Okay. The rates and the hazards, but it's in their population. They don't define it. I was actually surprised, given what I think that this population, these authors can actually access. Okay.
I felt like that conclusion is a huge statement that I didn't feel that. So, in conclusion, an increased BMI in late adolescence, even within the currently accepted normal range, was strongly associated with cardiovascular mortality in young adulthood or midlife. It doesn't account for the fact there was a huge difference between men and women, that the rate of death was huge. Like that's basically saying that across the board there's this huge change. Like that's not correct at all to what they showed us, I feel.
So for me, I think that there's the graded response in terms of, I take that as a take-home message, that it's just not being overweight or obese. What else did I have?
Like even with the grading, they don't separate that into men and women, so we don't know.
But they said it was the same for sex. When they actually pulled it out, they actually said that it adjusted, it was the same. It was for sex. It made no difference whether or not you were obese as a woman or obese as a man in terms of your hazard ratio. They're very similar. So they said there was no sex difference.
But there was a lot less who died.
Adjusted for sex, age of examination, birth year, education,
Yeah.
residential, socioeconomic status, country of origin, and height.
Yeah.
So the separation was the same, but the number of people who died on
Was much smaller.
exponentially smaller.
Exactly, it was much smaller in women, but they said that, and they actually, in their appendix, they have about 30 other pages of analyses that they did. I skimmed, and I don't remember seeing sex specific. So even though they had 22.3 million people, they didn't have a lot of deaths, but they still had enough data to do it. They did do a sample size calculation. Now, I know they're using the whole population, and so you say, well, technically you don't have to do a sample size calculation, but actually theoretically you should. So why would anybody fund this study if you don't have an outcome? Because you're getting all this privacy and going and looking at people's data about deaths, and you're not going to be able to answer your question because there aren't enough deaths. So they actually should have been able to say what the precision of their estimate they thought they would get in terms of mortality or something like that with having 2.3 million with 42 million years of follow-up. So that was my nitpick with New England Journal. They talked about 6.8% of the deaths that they didn't have any data on it, and so that they actually modeled a sensitivity analysis to try and sort of take into account that 6.8%. They imputed. Does anybody know what imputation is? So when you have missing data, they actually imputed. So they looked at it and they said, say Duncan was in the Army. Okay, Duncan, I think he is today. But we didn't know his socioeconomic status. So what we looked for is that we looked at similar characteristics of Duncan like other recruitees in terms that he was this tall and this weight, this age exactly, and then we didn't know his socioeconomic status. So we looked at all those 10 other Duncans and we said, well, all those 10 other Duncans roughly fell in this middle socioeconomic status, so that's what we're going to attribute to him. Rather than losing Duncan's information altogether, it's called case-wise deletion, so it's removing Duncan. If I don't have the full information, I throw him out. There's a bias by doing that. I want to keep Duncan in because Duncan's important. Thank you, Duncan. But it was in terms of saying there are enough people that are kind of similar to Duncan that I can kind of guess that this is what I had. So that they did impute, I don't do imputation, but I know what it is, in terms of filling in missing values so that you get as much information to keep the integrity of it. And so that was reasonable. It wasn't a limitation in terms of doing that. Does this change my practice? So now that we reviewed and critiqued this, does anybody else have any other limitations they want to bring up? Excuse me. How would you rate this article on a 5-star rating? Robin? Three and a half. Hands up for the 3.5s. Who would go a little bit higher or a little bit lower? I'd go up a little bit higher too. Okay. it change my practice?
I think the one big thing is that our growth curves are different, and so the 50 to 8, I'd like to see what, I looked at it quickly, like plotting myself at 17 on both of them, and I would like to see what the difference in our curves are compared to theirs.
So I can tell you in Canadian-wise, when we say that we're 30% overweight or obese and 13% obese, in the United States, it's roughly about the same percentages, but if you took the American data on their CDC and converted it to Canadian data, that their 30% would be close to 40% for overweight and obesity, and it's about 25% of the population on our growth chart. So, in fact, whether or not if you did it, you probably would, because you're still seeing the same gradation down, it still would probably be saying the reference might be like the 10th to the 20th percentile and everybody else.
Right, so I guess the risk is still there, but the hazard ratios are maybe not quite as high for our community.